Tonight, Iran is making Europe pick between them and the Trump administration. Iran says that when the Trump administration broke its nuke deal with them and increased sanctions on them, this is what Iran is saying, European countries said, we're not going to follow suit. Well, tonight, Iran seems to be saying to Europe, look, it's either the U.S. or us. Decide, or we are going to increase our stockpile of uranium to levels that, sorry, violate the terms of the treaty within 10 days because apparently the United States decided they didn't want the treaty. So this is Iran's position, okay? The Iran position seems to be strengthened by China's warning to the United States not to open, quote, this is what their diplomat said this morning, Pandora's box in the region, and by Russia's push back on the U.S. and by Turkey and India's decision to buy Russian weapon systems over the ones produced by the United States. Okay, that's the scenario. Joining us now, former Naval Intel Officer John Jordan and former U.S. diplomat Jim Jatras. Jim, I'm going to begin with you. I guess the question it behooves us to ask, do the Iranians have a point in this argument?
I think they do. To start with, one of the reasons they may be exceeding these limits is because of the U.S. sanctions themselves that make it impossible for them to export enriched uranium to stay under the limits, so it's going to build up and exceed those limits. And I think that, frankly, is part of the plan by people in Washington so that we can accuse them of violating the agreement. Now, whether that's going to scare the Europeans into actually getting a move on with maintaining economic ties with Iran, I think that's a real roll of the dice for the Iranians because we know what, I'm trying to think of a nice word for cowards, the Europeans are when it comes to standing up to the United States. Do
you think, John, that the Iranians might have a point in the argument that they seem to be making this morning?
Absolutely not. This is nothing more than blackmail. The U.S. withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, and it was not a treaty. It was not ratified by the United States Senate. Our Constitution has been around for all to see for over 200 years. President Obama couldn't even get most of the Democrats on Capitol Hill to support the Iran nuclear deal because it didn't deal with their missile programs or their exporting of terrorism, and it guaranteed them a nuclear weapon in 2025. Now, with regard to the Europeans, the European governments may be saying one thing, but European businesses have pulled out completely out of Iran. Total, the large French energy conglomerate, for example, pulled out of a $4.5 billion exploration project. So European companies really want nothing to do with Iran, regardless of what's coming out of Berlin, Brussels, or Paris.
Well, but to Jim's point then, if we do that and we're muscling companies all over the world to try and screw Iran over as much as they possibly can, aren't we putting you know the old story we used to be told as kids, if you back somebody into the corner, they have no place to go but forward? Are we doing that to Iran?
No, Iran is no viable military options. They do not have the ability to close the Straits of Hormuz. In fact, Iranian strategy has been carefully calibrated with these limpet mines and then shooting at those drones and then their activities in Yemen, not to harm, third neutral shipping or Americans directly. And what they're banking on is an American response, which may be a lot more violent, potentially bloody, which would change the political dynamic and cause international pressure to perhaps force the United States to give them sanctions relief. It's not going to work, but that's the Iranian strategy, to try to provoke the United States. The longer the United States sits pat, time is against the Iranians because of how fast their economy is unraveling.
Now, he's buying into the Pompeo story, but apparently the captain of the ship apparently disagrees with Pompeo's story. In fact, some people would argue that the United States is maybe fabricating some of its accusations against Iran. Where do you stand on this, Jim?
I'm highly skeptical, to say the least. I mean, given the lies we've been caught with in the past, whether obviously WMDs in Iraq, everybody forgets the lies about the Balkans that got us into the war in Kosovo. I just don't trust these people. Maybe I should have more faith in our leaders, but I don't. Now, look, John is right. We have a right to pull out of this agreement. Doesn't mean it's a smart thing to do.
Now, what about the question about, remember when George Bush formed the Coalition of the Willing? He got countries all over the world to back us when we were going to make our move against Iraq. Forget the fact that Iraq was a debacle, but at least we could knock on doors around the world and people would support us. Given what's gone on in the last, let's say, couple of months, are we creating a situation where we are less apt to be able to get willing partners to join any U.S. effort? I'm going to start with you, Jim.
Let's be clear. Other than the British, that's largely a fig leaf. Even during the Iraq War, remember, the French and the Germans wouldn't go along with it. Remember French surrender monkeys, freedom fries, and all that stuff? So even then, people even talking about a Paris, Berlin, Moscow axis that was opposed to the United States policy. I don't think all those countries really help us on these things. Quite the contrary, I call them enablers.
But less now.
I think even less now, and I'm glad less, because the more these countries would line up, the more it encourages people here to do something very dumb and destructive, because they say, look, we have a coalition behind us, even though it's really just us with some window dressing.
Like a fake coalition is what
Of course it's fake.
John, last word to you.
Oh, this is absolutely goofy. It depends on the issue. There's over 50 countries on the side of the United States with regard to Venezuela. Inside of the Middle East, we have the Gulf states, an enormous number of Arab states on our side with regard to Iran, because they see Iran as an existential threat. And with regard to our conflict with China, the Europeans are actually on our side. So what you see in these type of complex world we live in now is that on one issue, one country or several countries may be your allies, but they're opposing you on another issue at the very same time.
Yeah.
It's a lot more complicated than the other guests.
If we had a two-shot up, you'd see Jim shaking his head. Go ahead.
Final word. If all of that were true, we wouldn't have to threaten our so-called friends. We wouldn't have to threaten them with sanctions, threaten to destroy their companies and their economies.
Great discussion. Thanks to you both. Smart guys. We appreciate having you on. Jim and John, we thank you. I'm Rick Sanchez. You found us on YouTube, and that's awesome. But you know what? I'm also live every night at 7 and 8 p.m. Eastern on DirecTV and Dish and cable and satellite, the RT app, and Pluto TV. I'll see you there.